actually started the Zoom. So here we go, take two. Welcome to Three Things. And we are broadcasting live here from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. My name is Emma Cooper, and I am going to be talking with our climate reporter, Geoff Dembicki, who is coming at us from New York City, where he moved in September. And that is the territory of the Canarsie and the Lenape people. And Geoff has, if you're a Tyee fan, you know that Geoff is a longtime reporter. He started with us at the Tyee in 2008, right out of school, and he has been continually watching the climate file, reporting on it. And he started with a series that debuted on this Tyee called Are We Screwed? It was a millennial asking questions about climate change that eventually turned into a book. I make that sound easy. He had to write it, but it's a hopeful look at the climate movement and the people making a difference in there. So he moved to New York City to pursue and to talk and to write about climate change. And he's here to talk about that with us here in Three Things today. Please welcome Geoff Dembicki, everyone. Hey, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for turning on a light in your hot New York apartment so that we could hear your stories. Appreciate it. So Geoff, you moved to New York in September. You thought it would be, a good time to talk about climate. What happened?
Well, yeah, I guess that's a good place to start. And the reason that I moved to New York with my partner, Kara, in September was because I've been reporting on climate change for a long time, and I felt that the upcoming US election was just going to be like absolutely like momentous and historic in terms of what's possible on climate change. And I think if Trump wins, there's a good chance that a lot of the best case outcomes on climate change are no longer possible. And if Joe Biden wins, then who knows? But yeah, we moved here because I kind of wanted to be in the US during the lead up to that. And I'd been in Vancouver for a while, and people kept saying, "You're a writer, you can write from anywhere in the world." And I was like, yeah, definitely, but I'd never tried it. I'd never tried being somewhere else. So we thought, like, what the hell? Let's go to New York.
So this is, that is ultimately the big writer's leap. You move to New York, you're really going to do your best life. So you guys do this together, which is exciting. You get there in September. What's the first big story that you cover?
Well, the first big story that we were responding to was an infestation of cockroaches in our apartment. So I spent about the first third of the month of September dealing with those. And then by the time the cockroaches got under control, I was attending the United Nations Climate Action Summit. And so that was kind of my introduction to the city, cockroaches and the United Nations. And while I was at that summit, I had the opportunity to hang out with Greta Thunberg, although she probably would not have called it that. I was basically just like lurking around the side, watching one UN official after another go up and ask her to resolve these hugely complex questions. And they seem to believe this Swedish teenager had all the answers. But it was an exciting introduction to the city. And I wrote a piece for the Tyee about Greta addressing the youth climate strike, which was like hundreds of thousands of teenagers taking over the financial district of New York and calling for climate action. So the move started out challenging and exciting, but I had no idea what was coming next.
So you surmount the cockroaches. You're awed by Gen Z and their commitment to really taking to the streets. And then you think, okay, I'm going to hunker down. It's going to be pretty chill until the election.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. And I settled in a routine. I was doing a lot of climate reporting for the Tyee from a US angle, which was fun and exciting. And then about the end of February, Kara and I were going for a walk, and I said, you know what, these last 6 months have been a real change and quite turbulent, but I think things are settling down, and I feel good about the rest of the year. So that was about February 27th.
So if anyone's watching, don't get Geoff to pick your lotto numbers. It's not a good call. 0 for 1 in a big way. Okay, so you make that call, coronavirus hits, and New York is an epicenter. What does that do for you in terms of reporting on climate in your day-to-day life?
I mean, everything changed here really fast, as it did in Vancouver too, I imagine. But it went from like all of us just talking about coronavirus to the city like locking down within a matter of days, it felt like. But there was this very strange and surreal in between time when I jumped on a subway to go to an eye appointment downtown, and everyone on the car was just super nervous and looking at each other and trying to survey the situation. And I got out of the subway and everyone was like trying to avoid each other in the streets and having these really tense conversations. And then I remember just thinking it was amazing that I was walking into this building as this pandemic was about to start, and everyone was kind of trying to keep acting normal, but there was just this intensity to everything. And then the city effectively shut down, and for about a month, I mean, there were storefronts everywhere and in our neighborhood were locked up. You could walk down streets that were normally very busy and there would be nobody on them whatsoever. I went for a bike ride to Times Square, and there was about 3 people there, and I stopped in the middle of Broadway on my bike back and just took some photos. So it was a very strange time in those early days.
Well, and contrasting the empty streets to how full the streets would get with the protests and the Black Lives Matter and the anti-police brutality, gatherings, and you went to some of those. Could you talk about a little bit of that for you?
Yeah, so after a couple months of coronavirus, things kind of settled into this pattern. And I think a lot of people in the city were feeling like, we can't just be at this level of a panic forever. We have to live our lives. On the other hand, the conditions here were really crazy. Like millions of people lost their jobs. Kara was doing mutual aid and helping people in our neighborhood get food, because there were tons of families who weren't even able to afford basic grocery bills. But the city kind of settled into this rhythm, and life moved forward. And then all of a sudden, that video appeared of the terrible video of the Minneapolis police killing George Floyd, and right away there were protests down at the Barclays Center in downtown Brooklyn. And Kara and I, we watched the videos online like lots of people, and police were beating up protesters with batons. And then a few days later, a cop drove his SUV into protesters, and this stuff was, as I'm sure anyone watching this will remember, seemed to be everywhere at the time. And Kara and I were unsure what to do initially, because we were scared of being in a crowd and getting coronavirus. And we were unsure about our position, first of all, like as white people, as Canadians, as people here on a visa, what it would mean if we got put in jail. But that only lasted a few days, and then we thought, okay, no, we have to go be a part of this.
So that's a lot happening all at once. You guys go into the protests, but I think that piece of moving from, is this for me to even be a part of, to going, and you've talked about being at protests in front of the Brooklyn jail and all these sort of moments that were really intense. How does that translate into your conversation with Bill McKibben, who could give a little context on him and where he's at, wondering about where climate is at given coronavirus and on all of the changes that are happening?
So yeah, when we were all kind of going into lockdown in those early days, I think there was just this sense of confusion and kind of like a brain fog as we were discussing the other day. And I think that was like felt by like billions of people around the world. But part of the brain fog was like, one of the symptoms of that was to feel kind of like you were the only one experiencing that. And so I spoke with Bill McKibben for the Tyee, kind of at the height of that, just feeling totally disoriented and confused. And I got on the phone with him and I realized that, in fact, he was super confused and unsure of what the next step should be for the climate movement. And that was quite remarkable for me to see, because I've always known Bill McKibben as someone with absolute moral clarity, always knows what the next step is for climate activism. And we talked on the phone and he said, well, maybe some things will move online. We're going to have to recalibrate, but you know, we're just not sure right now. And in a weird way, that gave me a bit of perspective, because I was like, oh, okay, this event, this pandemic is just so huge that it's beyond any one person's understanding. And to a certain extent, we're just going to have to ride it out all together.
And definitely humbling to hear the founder of 350.org kind of going, not sure. Like you said, that's something. It is very humanizing. And the idea that, you know, we're all in this together is a really uniting kind of factor. Anything else that you kind of took from that conversation with him that kind of helped you orient yourself back towards really focusing on writing for climate amidst all of the things that were happening?
Well, I mean, even at the time, he was saying, you know, as we're going through this pandemic together, the climate emergency is getting worse, and that definitely is not going to be felt by everyone equally. It's going to land hardest on Indigenous communities and Black communities that have been forced to live in lower lying coastal areas, more exposed to floods. And so the inequities of the climate emergency have been clear for some time. But as we moved further into coronavirus, it was also really startling to see that Black people and non-white people in general were dying of coronavirus at higher rates. And part of the reason for that ended up being explained in this Harvard study, which showed that if you breathe in air pollution your whole life, that makes you more susceptible to coronavirus. And it so happens that a lot of communities of color are built next to polluting fossil fuel infrastructure. And so that information was becoming more widely acknowledged just as these massive demonstrations against police brutality took off. And that started a really interesting conversation in the climate change world.
And can you dig into that conversation? Because I think the tendency that, you know, I'm not in the climate conversation, but it's pretty easy and understandable for people to go, ooh, we got this deadline. It's pretty important. Let's just, whoever's got the loudest voice, let's listen to them and trying to make it happen, versus trying to bring everyone in and center folks who are marginalized. Can you talk a little bit more about that centering piece?
Yeah, totally. And the way this played out in what I was witnessing was that you had these massive street demonstrations happening in New York and all over the world. I heard Vancouver's was really huge, and a bunch of mainstream environmental groups were really unsure how to respond to that. Some of them took days or even weeks to put out statements, and that was noticed by a lot of people. And then meanwhile, some of the younger groups, like the Sunrise Movement and 350, they immediately got behind calls to defund the police, which is what the protesters were asking for. And you know, it was just pretty interesting for me to watch this all play out, because I think to the average person, it's not totally obvious how defunding the police could contribute to fighting climate change. But when you take a step back and look at some of the theories of change of these groups, it makes a lot of sense. Like 350 has always said, you know, one of the ways we're going to fix the climate emergency is getting a huge movement of people out on the streets challenging the status quo. And And that was exactly what was happening. I read later that the Black Lives Matter demonstrations were the biggest protest movement in US history, with over 10% of the population involved at one point. And a lot of the people in those protests, Black people, are highly supportive of climate solutions. So for environmental groups to get behind that meant that they were amplifying a movement that was challenging vested interests and political leaders, and also organizing people who want to fix the climate emergency, even though that wasn't the explicitly stated purpose.
Right. And centering the people, as you said previously, most impacted by climate. So amazing. Now, that's a lot to kind of be processing all at once. And you also are looking forward to kind of policy in Canada amidst all of this. You wrote a piece for the Tyee that talked about where the green policy could be, maybe should be going. Can you talk more about that, given the context we're in now?
Yeah, so I think there's the tendency of Canadians to think that a lot of the racism that exists in the US doesn't exist in Canada, and especially in the environmental movement to think that, this climate is basically just like this big like scientific or economic problem, and race doesn't really factor into it the same way. What I realized being here, and it seems like so obvious now, is that the majority of debates we've had about climate change in Canada have been about racial disparities. Because if you look at the 10 years of protest over oil pipelines and infrastructure, those fights have primarily been led by Indigenous communities who are protesting not only the oil development, but also centuries of state-sanctioned violence and poor treatment towards their communities. And so when I wrote this piece on what a green recovery could look like in Canada, I really wanted to test out some of the mainstream solutions that were being touted, such as energy retrofits and clean energy, and see what someone from the group Indigenous Climate Action thought about that. And that ended up being a fascinating conversation, because just to give a quick example, a lot of green recovery advocates were talking about retrofitting millions of homes across Canada and how that would be great and reduce emissions and create jobs. The woman from Indigenous Climate Action, Lindsay, she said, that sounds great, but a lot of Indigenous people aren't even at the point of talking about retrofits because there's a housing crisis among Inuit in the far north. First Nations and Métis women are still at a greater risk of going missing or being murdered because they don't have appropriate housing. So many reserves have water they can't drink. So before we talk about anything to do with a green recovery, we need to be addressing those basic human rights issues.
So get things livable and then proceed with the solution. Is what I'm hearing. So again, that comes back to that centering piece. We've got a couple questions that kind of fit into sort of your position or your thoughts on different policies or different moments. So this one's from Eric from Zoom. He asked, what is your position about peaceful resistance and blockage of the TMX by actual mass physical presence at pipeline construction sites?
I mean, I think that's been a tool or a tactic. I mean, that's been used to resist unjust projects and power for forever, basically, for as long as people have been alive. And I think if that type of resistance is done peacefully, it fits into a long tradition, and especially when we're talking about like the human rights of Canada's original inhabitants, and in a climate emergency that only really gives us like 10 years to take the action needed, then that type of resistance doesn't sound all that unreasonable to me.
So I'm hearing you say when you putting it in the right context helps frame it up. If you're like, oh, this is stopping something that might make a job or two happen, then it looks different. So it's a big part of perspective taking is part of that.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I'm not saying like one way or the other. This is what needs to happen, but I think there's a reaction that a lot of people have when they see that type of protest, and they assume those people are all radicals. And I just want to bring a perspective to that, because there's a long and rich tradition of civil disobedience, and it has proven to be very effective.
And another question coming in is asks, what is your take on the recent challenges to capacity of wind and solar to replace fossil fuels? For example, Michael Schellenberg's Apocalypse Never and Michael Moore's movie Planet of the Humans.
I mean, what I'll say about that is Michael Moore's documentary has been critiqued by just about every smart climate person that I know and that I follow online. And he's not responded in a good faith way to those critiques. So I think, you know, I would take what he says in that documentary with a grain of salt. And I've read reviews of it by scientists and clean energy economists, and they say a lot of the data in that film is like over a decade out of date. And so I think in terms of the capacity challenges for wind and solar, like they exist, and that's always been a challenge, but there's like so many smart people working on those challenges right now, and the technology is advancing so quickly. So I don't see that being a serious limiting factor. And I follow Bloomberg's new climate vertical, and they do a lot of reporting about how those challenges can be surmounted.
That's hopeful. And we've got the questions coming fast and furious here. So this one's from Dave, which is kind of ties into the whole reason you moved to New York, which is ultimately to report on this election in the US that is going to be pretty make or break as far as climate. And Dave asks, hi, Geoff, with your perspective from NYC and the USA, if, and let's for the record, if is capitalized and in asterisks, if Biden is successful in November's election and the Senate majority has a shift to the Democrats, how realistic are the chances of a real and quick action on green and climate protection initiatives there?
I mean, I think it's very realistic. A lot of climate activists had ideally wanted to see another Democrat win the nomination. I think Joe Biden was almost everybody's last choice. I think Greenpeace gave him an F at one point on his climate plan, but he's shifted a lot over the past few months. And now people that were among his major critics are now writing op-eds in The Guardian saying, actually, this might be the most like climate progressive candidate that has ever run for president in the US. So if Congress returns to the Democrats and Joe Biden is president, what we could see is like a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus that's built around investments in clean energy and low carbon housing. And what's exciting to a lot of climate justice people is that Biden has promised that 40% of those investments will go to historically disadvantaged communities, to cleaning up the air that they breathe and their water. So if capital IF, this were to all happen, we'd for the first time ever see climate justice become the center of US policymaking. And I mean, there's so many possibilities for change that could result from that.
And for the sake of talking about Trump, because I think we got in trouble last time not taking him seriously, do you want to paint a bit of a picture, should he win, what that might look like for climate?
I mean, it would be absolutely terrible. And I've done reporting. I don't want to like bum everyone out, but
it's kind of part of your job. I think it's in the job description. Sorry, man.
There's like serious smart people who've done like calculations on what a Trump victory would mean, and they basically all concluded that would sort of be it for any like best case outcome on climate change. Like with less than a decade left to achieve these like really ambitious goals, having four more years of a climate denier doing everything he can to prop up oil, coal, and gas would would be absolutely devastating. I mean, I think the social movements would grow stronger. The business case for clean energy would get better and better, but not having that leadership, I think, would be massively bad.
I like that. My expert, based on my readings, I'm going to say massively bad. Okay. So, and coming back, I think it's really interesting to hear about that shift of people initially who are interested in climate, not necessarily championing Biden, and him shifting his platform over time to now it being very central, to having climate central in what he's campaigning on. Coming back to Canada, what do you see for our climate policy? What are things that you would like to see, sort of those tangible get or done things in our policy moving forward?
I mean, Canada is doing carbon pricing now, which required a massive political effort and created all this resistance from conservatives. And the policy is just, it's not that popular. It's been defeated a lot of times in the US, especially with oil company groups opposing it. But I mean, Canada got it done, and that's a big deal. And I think it's an important step. What you're seeing now with Biden is the evolution of that. So it's going beyond just putting a price on carbon and hoping the market works it out, to saying, like, the government is going to spend trillions of dollars and direct that investment to communities, often communities of color, who are already suffering from climate change. And the government's essentially going to create millions of jobs. And I think there's already been an effort to put the Green New Deal on the agenda in Canada. And I think with Biden in office doing something like that seriously, there would be massive pressure for Canada to follow suit. And I think our carbon pricing would be the first small step on the road to that.
Right. Now, what do you think? I'm going to modify a question from Kathleen on Facebook, who said, would you agree that a national retrofit program is needed in both Canada and the US, like a more coordinated effort? And you had spoken earlier about retrofits help some people, and it might not be the most inclusive solution, but the question about a coordinated effort between the two countries, I think, is really interesting. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and I didn't bring up retrofits to trash them either. I think it's a good climate solution, and I think it actually would create so many jobs, because it's super labor intensive. You need like an army of workers to go into people's homes and fix them up. But I think what would be really exciting is to have retrofits be part of a massive like national housing strategy that was pushed in both the US and Canada. And we could have people on both sides of the border learning from each other, studying that. Like, Biden has said he wants to spend, I think, $600 billion on affordable housing as part of a climate package. And that's absolutely what we need to see in Canada. In Vancouver, you've got like luxury condo towers going up that are like state-of-the-art green, but who can afford a $5 million condo in the heart of downtown? And so I think
I've been saving up, but it's going to be a minute before I get there.
I mean, I can buy one because climate reporting is so lucrative,
right.
But
yeah.
I'm worried about the rest of us.
That's very nice. Right. So I like that. You're talking about a bigger kind of game plan that would have lots of parts, including retrofits, including other things that would bring people in. And I think we've got time for one more question. I'm going to sneak it in because it's from my mom. And she asks, how do we as Canadians keep climate change front and center with the current focus on COVID? How do both of these issues go hand in hand? And how do we create wins for all? My mom wants a lot. She's got high expectations. She wants you to fix this. She's looking for the silver bullet. So, whoa, please deliver.
I mean, I think a green recovery, or a just recovery, as some groups are calling it, is a way to do all of that in Canada. And basically, you'd have the government doing something like a Green New Deal to help stimulate the economy and to accelerate us to greener businesses. And at the same time, rebuilding a social safety net for all the people who've suffered through coronavirus. And I think a really interesting way you could see that play out is if the government said, we're accelerated to a complete phase out of the oil sands, which the Trudeau government would never do, obviously. But let's just say you had a federal government that said, this is an extremely volatile business, and that oil has been, there are major banks from around the world that are cutting ties. It's threatened economically. We're going to do the same thing we did for coal and say, this industry has to wind down. But if the government paired that with a guarantee to pay the wages and benefits of all the workers employed in that and retrain them for other industries, and meanwhile help create opportunities for people to start new businesses, I think you'd neutralize a lot of the political opposition to that. And that sounds crazy, but it's basically what the government was already doing with the coronavirus stimulus. Like on a dime, suddenly people could just get CERB benefits. And whereas in the US, it's been a lot scarier to be out of work. Because the coronavirus in Canada, people got that money relatively easily, and it helped.
Right. And that's a good point, is being able to bring everyone along, and then people being able to ask for that support. And anything hopeful, just to wrap it up. I know there was another question from Eric sort of saying both Trudeau and Horgan seem to be weaker on the climate file over time. Do you think that Canadian mainstream political parties can be trusted to really act on climate as necessary? That's kind of that's a leading pessimistic question that I'm going to ask you to kind of matrix into a hopeful way to end this. You've been reporting on climate long enough. I think you can do it.
Okay. Challenge accepted.
Beautiful.
I think the politicians on their own are just going to defer to what we've already been doing in the economy. I think they're like, yeah, fixing climate change is good, but then they get in the room with like CEOs and they're like, okay, yeah, we won't do that. But I think absolutely every political party would respond to like millions of Canadians like just demanding we make climate a top priority. It already started to happen a bit in the lead up to the federal election. Climate change was a really big issue. Arguably the biggest it's been, and we're in a moment for profound political and cultural change. Like millions of people have watched or taken part in the movement for Black Lives demonstrations. They're closely examining inequality in their neighborhoods and cities. Concern about climate change is absolutely higher than ever, and it's becoming a central part of how parties in the US and in Europe are governing. And then at the same time, we've seen through COVID that the governments can marshal huge resources very quickly to deal with a problem that affects our survival. So I think the moment is right for a step change in the politics of this. And I think if tons of people join up together, join groups, figure out how they can build their collective political power, I think now is the time for that to really change the way things are done.
You did it. That was a Matrix-esque answer. The time is now. Governments will listen if we all use our loud voices. That's what I took away. And thank you so much for reporting live from your hot New York City apartment, Geoff. We do this every week. This has been a wonderful chat. Next week, we'll be talking with our new downtown East Side reporter, Jen St. Dennis. So tune in then. And until then, take care. Thank you. Bye.